Mexicans during the Great Migration between 1900 to the 1930s. And this is about how Mexicanos dealt with discrimination. All right, in the decades between the 1910s and 1930s, this period is referred to as the Great Migration. While many Americans point to Ellis Island as the main point of emphasis during this era, many forget about the southwestern migration of the United States, which mainly consisted of Mexicanos. Compared to the Europeans arriving from Europe, Mexicanos faced more prejudice from the Anglo-Americans upon arrival. Nonetheless, Nonetheless, as they faced discrimination, Mexicanos had several ways of dealing with it. Many of these ways were from nationalism, disinterest in assimilation, and confined Mexican communities were some of the major reactions from the Mexican communities in dealing with racism. Mexican immigration was already relevant in the early 1900s, but what accelerated the migration of Mexicanos to the U.S. was the chaotic Revolutionary War that was occurring in Mexico City and that happened at the span of 10 years, which began in 1910. I mean, with no end in sight, this conflict brought unemployment, poverty, illnesses, death, and etc. Mexicanos were being ill-treated. This prolonged inner conflict much caused the Mexicans to look north for jobs. Mass migration from the southwest was already apparent to the Anglo-Americans, the U.S. Many natives and restrictionists wanted stricter border control and viewed Mexicanos as individuals who were racially inferior to that of the Anglo-Americans. Despite the opinions of the natives and the restrictionists, which resonated with the majority of the public at the time, they found themselves on the losing side because the state governments, the federal government, acknowledged the importance of cheap labor that Mexicanos provided in both the agricultural business and the industrial job business, in which were established all throughout the southwestern states and other regions of the U.S. With Mexicanos being mere peasants, unskilled, along with arriving in a new environment where they were not welcomed by the Anglo Americans, nor being able to speak or understand English, it was inevitable that they would be facing discrimination along with low wages, followed by long hours of work and deprived working conditions. Not in deprived working conditions. Nonetheless, these characteristics were not as irrelevant to the Mexicano as being able to find a job to send money back to their families who lived in Mexico. This attitude was in the minds of many Mexicans, as well it be demonstrated. Mexicans' responses were somewhat tolerant because they had intentions or plans to return to their former country. This led to a sense of nationalism and connection to their native land. Mexicanos' motives of wanting to return to their native countries also allude to the idea that they were not very keen on the American way of life. Although discrimination was indeed a hassle, the idea of wanting to return to Mexico demonstrates that many took the job simply because they thought it would be temporary and they would soon leave. Then there was a disinterest in assimilation. In 1908, Israel Zangwill described the United States as the melting pot of the world. This emphasized the many ethnicities, cultures, and nationalities that were currently living that were living all throughout the United States, especially in New York City. Zangwill's statement was also meant to underline the assimilation of immigrants into American society. But this was hardly the case in the Southwest concerning Mexicans. Unlike European migrants, Mexicanos were constantly moving and were indeed illegal in the country. This led to many Mexicanos mostly taking migratory jobs from railway repair to the automotive industry to the agricultural business. In several ways, these migratory jobs made it difficult and unappealing for the Mexicano to settle within the United States. According to Gonzales Manuel in his work Mexicanos, A History of Mexicans in the United States, migratory jobs often meant poor sanitation, living conditions, diseases like tuberculosis that were rampant at the time, and the offensive odor of rotting corpse with regarding to agricultural jobs. At last, with invasions of rodents and insects was unimaginable. And last but not least was the lack of education. Education was critical because it provided education to the children, opening the door towards social mobility. Migratory jobs made this impossible for the Mexicano. Unlike their counterparts in New York City, Mexicanos had it or at times were discouraged and integrated into America's melting pot. Along with discrimination from the Anglos, who believed assimilation with Mexicanos was unthinkable. Logically, such circumstances led Mexicans to become disinterested in integrating into the American society. Finally, Mexicans began to live in their own communities. Finally, Mexicans began to live in their own communities to distance themselves from the Anglo Americans. Upon arrival in the U.S., Mexicans knew that living with the Anglos would not be accessible due to discrimination. One good example would be the academic journal published by professors from the University of Florida, Neil Bertrand and Raymond A. They emphasize how the alienation of Mexicanos in the city of Gray, Indiana, led to the Mexicans responding by developing their own confined communities. The professors reached the conclusion that what alienated Mexicanos from the Anglo communities were the much higher rents paid by Mexicans compared to the Anglo Americans. And not only they were being discriminated against, but many Mexican families lived in filthy, adequate facilities. This research demonstrates that in order for Mexicanos not to be taken advantage of, they distanced themselves from the Anglo communities, and as a result, many started to create their own communities. These Mexican communities became known as barrios. Barrios were isolated neighborhoods on the outskirts of industrial cities where most of the inhabitants were Mexican. These barrios, Mexicans had the freedom to speak their language, listen to the music, and celebrate their traditions without under the watchful eye of Anglo Americans. These confined Mexican communities were another factor of Mexicans slowly integrating into American society, because these communities were ideal for Mexicans to maintain and practice as much as their unique culture and rarely experience American culture. To round it up, Mexican assimilation into American society was by no means their fault, but opportunities were taken away from them through discrimination. In the list, factors such as nationalism, disinterest in integration, and confined Mexican communities were some of the major responses from Mexicanos on how they dealt with racism during the Great Migration. And here are some of the references. Thanks for watching.